Hey there. If tonight you want to drift far, far away from reality, then let this story unfold. A place where beauty once made even the gods tremble. Medusa, a girl with hair like waves and eyes as sharp as a blade of light. She could still the sea and make even the divine forget the limits of their power. Her beauty was too vast for the world to bear, and so, in the fear of the gods, it became a curse. Tonight, as your breath begins to slow, let me tell you her story, softly and from very far away. Before we begin, maybe take a moment to subscribe if you like quiet nights like this, and tell me where you are and what time it is there, so we can listen together under the same sky. When you close your eyes, imagine standing on a land long lost, where dry hills touch the sky, where the waves of the Mediterranean crash against white cliffs, and where humans, still so small before the vastness of the universe, began naming every thunder, every wind, every star. To the ancient Greeks, the world wasn't a cold machine. Everything had a soul. Thunder was the voice of Zeus, the sea was the breath of Poseidon, and wisdom, order, and reason within humans were the gentle warmth of Athena. When they looked up at a cloudy sky, they didn't just see rain, they saw will. When they heard the sound of waves, it wasn't just water, it was anger. When sunlight streamed through marble columns, they saw a sign, something sacred, quietly watching back. In that world, the gods were never separate from men. They hid within every phenomenon, and humans, not wanting to feel lost, gave those forces faces, names, and tempers, to make fear something they could recognize. Because every civilization, when faced with what it cannot understand, always begins with a story. And in ancient Greece, those stories took the shape of myth. Maybe fear was the first thing that taught humans how to imagine. Afraid of thunder, they saw Zeus. Afraid of the sea, they heard Poseidon. Afraid of darkness, they lit the image of Hades to bring order to death itself. But at the edge of the world they understood, where the light of reason couldn't yet reach, monsters were born, not to frighten, but to fill the space of the unknown. Among the gray rocks where sea and land blend into one, they imagined half-human, half-beast creatures, wings unfurling from their backs, eyes that never closed, and hair that hissed like snakes whispering through the night. That was where fear took shape, so humans could look at it without dissolving. And among those countless shapes, one face would endure through time. Medusa, who carried in her gaze both the power of gods and the loneliness of humankind. Before there was Medusa, there was a world that needed her to understand itself. The Greeks did not create monsters to scare, but to measure the limits of being human, to ask when beauty becomes a sin, when curiosity becomes offense, and when weakness becomes punishment. So mythology was never mere fantasy. It was a mirror reflecting the ancient human soul. Proud gods, terrifying monsters, and forgotten victims. All were fragments of humanity's effort to accept one simple truth. We cannot control everything. When we read these stories today, we often do so with the eyes of reason, trying to understand, to analyze, to find the true meaning. But the Greeks were different. They didn't need to understand in order to believe. They simply felt and allowed fear to become part of the natural order. They worshipped their gods out of love, out of fear, and out of a longing to see themselves in a greater picture. When they sculpted Zeus, they were shaping their own will. When they painted Athena, they were honoring human wisdom amid chaos. And when they carved the face of the Gorgon on shields, they were saying that fear, too, could be a form of protection. Tonight, as you listen, you don't need to remember every god's name. You don't need to decode every layer of meaning. Just imagine that once, when the world was still small, people lit their way through the dark with stories. Each flame was a god. Each god was a name given to something beyond control. And among those small lights, one burned bright, then vanished into silence. That was the story of Medusa. She was not the beginning, but the gathering of every fear and every wish to be seen. Before we meet her, we must understand the world that made her, a world where gods and men were only a prayer apart, where beauty could be a blessing or a curse, and where every breeze carried the breath of something divine. If your eyes feel heavy now, don't resist. Let your breath slow, like the flicker of an old oil lamp in a Greek night. And as you drift, the gods remain, standing upon Olympus, watching quietly, like stars that never fade. And somewhere, between sea and stone, in the salt mist and the soft, mournful wind, a girl is waiting to be told again. Medusa, the one who reminds us that sometimes fear itself can wear the face of mercy. In the place where light no longer reaches and waves sound only like the ocean's slow sigh, there lies a body of water older than Zeus himself, so deep that the Greeks called it the primordial sea. It wasn't a place for ships to pass, but the place where all fear first took form. They believed that deep within it lived two ancient deities, Phorcys and Sato, beings that belonged neither to the sky nor the land, but lingered between what was known and what was not. Phorcys was called the guardian of the deep, his body scaled, his eyes dull like fogged glass. Sato was the terror of the sea, a goddess of strange beauty, neither alluring nor cruel, just calm, like the sound of waves that never stop. When those two forces met, from the salt and darkness were born the three Gorgon sisters. They had wings of bronze, fangs sharp as a predator's, and hair that moved as if it were alive. But among them, only one was mortal, Medusa. From the moment she was born, she was a paradox. Her blood was part divine, but her spirit was human. She came from the deep sea, but was bound by mortal limits. And in the Greek world, where every creature had to belong to one realm, being in between was the most frightening thing of all. For the ancient Greeks, the sea was not just a place, it was a mood, something that could not be controlled or owned. It could give gifts, and just as easily take everything back in anger. Deep within their minds, the sea symbolized chaos, something without a name, without order. And when they said Medusa was born from that sea, they weren't just describing a creature, they were giving fear a face. The Greeks saw Phorcys and Sato as living remnants of the Titan Age, beings left behind when the world shifted from chaos into order. They were leftovers from the time when chaos still breathed, when shapes were still finding where they belonged. Phorcys and Sato, therefore, were not parents in the human sense, but origins, the place where beauty and terror were born together. When we hear their names, we might think of monsters, but in the old stories they weren't hated. They were simply the parts of the world humans had not yet learned to control. Phorcys embodied depth, and Sato, the instinct of fear within the human mind. From them, Medusa carried both legacies, the stillness of the sea floor and the loneliness of something the world chose not to face. If we see myth as a mirror for the soul, then Medusa's family was the reflection of what could not be named. The Greeks always divided the world in two, the part lit by gods and the part left in darkness. Medusa and her parents lived on that border, where light touched only half a face, where everything could be both sacred and terrifying. Imagine it for a moment. Above the water, the world of men, loud, warm, ruled by law. Below, the world of Phorcys and Ceto. Slow, heavy, voiceless. Every movement there was the heartbeat of fear itself. And from that rhythm, Medusa was born, belonging to both life and stillness. Maybe that's why, in every story about her, you can always hear the sea, a sound that never stops, both soothing and haunting, beautiful and sad. She was the daughter of the sea, not a blue or clear sea, but the night sea, the sea of dreams, the sea of the subconscious. In that realm, gods and monsters are not so different. One wrong step, one misplaced gaze, and what is worshipped can become what is cursed. Medusa carried both within her. And as in all myths, when there is someone in between, the story always ends in tragedy. But before that tragedy began, she was still just a child, her hair damp from the ocean, her eyes quiet. No god on Olympus looked down to see her, and no human ever looked up. She existed in silence, a pause between two heartbeats of the world. In her, beauty and terror had not yet parted ways. If you listen carefully, you might still hear that sound, the waves breaking on distant cliffs, the sound of the primordial sea human language has never named. It is the breath of Phorcys and Ceto, the ancient things that still breathe within myth. Tonight, we'll stop here, between the sound of water and the edge of darkness, where every myth begins, not with light, but with an echo rising from the sea. If your eyes are starting to close, let this story move with your breath, because the next part will tell how that fear became protection, how the first Gorgon face was carved into stone, so that humankind could learn to look calmly at what once made them tremble. In the ancient Greek world, no one truly believed they could erase fear. People simply learned to live with it, through rituals, through symbols, through stories. And one of the most enduring of those symbols was the face of the Gorgon. They carved it above temple gates, painted it on clay jars, forged it onto warriors' shields, and even hung it at the head of their beds. A twisted face, glaring eyes, a tongue sticking out, and hair made of snakes, always in motion. At first glance, it was a nightmare, but to the Greeks it was protection. They had a word for it, apotropaic, something that drives away evil by the very power of fear itself. In other words, they used fear to guard themselves from fear. A strange idea, yes, but deeply human, because when escape is impossible, we learn to look straight at what we fear. If you could step into a temple of Athena back then, you would see the Gorgon's face staring down from the roof. Not to threaten those who entered, but to warn what must not enter. Restless spirits, dark thoughts, the anger of the gods. It was fear shaped into a shield. Perhaps it was one of humanity's earliest forms of therapy. They didn't hide their fear. They painted it, looked straight at it, and hung it on their walls, so that every day when they saw it, fear became familiar, and therefore less cruel. That face, round eyes, sharp teeth, long tongue, might unsettle the modern gaze. But if you look a little longer, you'll see something deeply human inside it. Resistance. Not resistance against the gods, but against the feeling of being swallowed by what can't be controlled. That's why the Greeks loved this image so much. They didn't fear the monstrous. They feared losing the ability to face it. By drawing the Gorgon, they were practicing not to turn away from chaos, like waking from a nightmare. Only when you turn toward it does the dream begin to fade. And among the countless Gorgon faces carved in stone, there was one that looked different, softer, almost beautiful beneath the horror. Not a monster's face, but Medusa's. No one knows why the first artist carved her that way. Maybe he had heard of the one Gorgon who was mortal. Maybe, in a dream, he saw eyes that held not just terror, but something like sorrow. Slowly, the Gorgon's image began to change, from grotesque to tragic. The fierce glare softened. The open mouth closed. The snakes remained, but they seemed tired now, curling gently around her hair, no longer trying to frighten anyone. Storytellers began to whisper. Maybe the Gorgon was once a girl. A girl turned into the very thing people feared. A girl whose beauty once calmed the sea, but stirred the hearts of gods. And so the Gorgon's face became a clue, not just to fear, but to compassion. From a charm against evil, it became a question. What turns a person into a monster? The Greeks never agreed on one answer. Some said it was punishment, others a kind of salvation. But deep down, everyone knew. Every myth begins with fear, and survives only because within that fear, there's still a trace of humanity. If you're sitting in a dark room now, with only the sound of a fan, and you imagine that face hanging above a temple gate, it may not seem so frightening anymore, because it's been there for thousands of years, standing guard for humankind, watching the border between the mortal and the divine. Each time a Greek warrior went to battle, he carried the Gorgon on his shield, as if bringing his own fear into the open. Not to terrify his enemies, but to remind himself, only by looking into fear can one pass through it. And tonight, if your eyes begin to close, picture that Gorgon face gazing down from a white temple gate. Moonlight tracing each carved line, sea wind brushing across stone lips. She says nothing, but somehow, you understand, every monstrous face in myth is just a mirror of human fear, softened by the wish to tame it. And among them all, there is one face, not quite monster, not quite god, with eyes still full of sadness. That is Medusa, not the source of fear, but the consequence of being feared. Before she was a monster, Medusa was human. She wasn't born from wrath, but from faith and devotion. The Greeks said she was the most beautiful maiden in Athens, her hair soft as silk, shimmering under sunlight like threads of gold. Her eyes didn't frighten anyone. They silenced them, because they were clear like a well reflecting the sky. She was chosen to serve as a priestess of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, justice, and order. It was a great honor, but it came with a vow, a life of purity and restraint. Inside the marble temple, everything followed a rule. Each flower placed at the right corner, each footstep echoing in measured rhythm, each prayer spoken softly, evenly, and clear. Medusa lived in a world of light and discipline, where even the smallest mistake was seen as an offense to the divine. The temple of Athena stood high above, looking down on the city of Athens, where people traded, loved, envied, and made mistakes. Medusa saw it all from afar, but she no longer belonged to that world. She belonged to the realm of stillness. At night, when wind swept through the corridors, the only sounds were reeds trembling in sacred water jars, and the whisper of fabric brushing marble. The world inside the temple was one without passion. Only reason, only the clean order of the mind. Athena was worshipped for that. She held the world steady through thought. But humans, even priestesses, carry something that no god can ever rule: emotion. Maybe that's why later legends said Medusa was beautiful enough to be dangerous, not because she wished to tempt anyone, but because in a world of perfect rules, natural beauty was a flaw in the system. Athena stood for reason, Poseidon stood for instinct, and Medusa, priestess of Athena, stood between the two. In Greek myth, everything that lies between is dangerous, between mortal and god, between logic and feeling, between order and chaos. Medusa didn't know it, but her very existence was a contradiction. They say one damp, dim afternoon, Poseidon, god of the sea, entered the temple. No one was allowed to, but Poseidon was a god, and gods don't understand the word forbidden. He came like a wave, carrying salt and sea wind, and his gaze fell upon Medusa's face like moonlight on still water. What happened next depends on who tells the story. Some say he forced himself upon her. Others say she was swept away in the tide of his power. Whatever version you choose, one thing is certain: Athena was furious, but not at Poseidon. Her anger fell on her own priestess. That was the first moment in myth when a human was punished not for a sin, but for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. None of the gods defended her. In that world, justice belonged to the strong. Even Athena's wisdom did not stand outside that law. From here, the story of Medusa shifts from light to shadow, from the temple of reason to the realm of punishment. And she, who once prayed for order, was about to become a proof of how fragile divine justice could be. If your breath has slowed by now, don't worry. That's the natural rhythm of the tale. Because from this moment on, Medusa will no longer be blessed, but cursed, a soul so beautiful it frightened even the gods. Let your mind drift a little. Hear the wind brushing over stone roofs, sand swirling around marble pillars. Imagine the girl still standing there, inside the temple, unaware that her world is about to change forever. Tonight, as we pause here, remember this. Before there was a gaze that turned men to stone, there was once a look that was clear, trusting, and deeply human. That was Medusa, priestess of Athena, who offered herself to wisdom, and was condemned by that very wisdom itself. That afternoon, the sky over Athens hung heavy like lead. The wind carried damp air from the sea at Piraeus, salt threading through the narrow streets, rising all the way to the marble steps where the temple of Athena stood still. The temple was as white and silent as ever, a symbol of wisdom and order. But the wind does not obey. It kept blowing, stronger and stronger, as if the sea were searching for a way back into a place it was never meant to belong. And in that wind, Poseidon arrived. Not as a monster, but like a wandering wave, carrying the strength of water and the recklessness of instinct. The Greeks called him Earth-shaker, the one who makes the ground tremble. And when he stepped into the temple, the marble beneath his feet seemed to shiver. Inside, Medusa was praying. Every evening she offered seawater to Athena's statue, for in ancient faith, water was a symbol of pure thought, the flow of clarity and renewal. But today, that water tasted of salt. The scent of the sea rose up, as though the ocean itself had entered the sanctuary. Poseidon stood behind her. No thunder, no voice, only the silence of waves. A silence so deep that you could almost hear the beating of her heart. The Greeks never described that moment in detail. They only said, Poseidon desecrated the temple of Athena. He defiled it. No one said how. Only that from that instant onward, the sea had invaded the realm of wisdom, and order was broken. Athena, goddess of reason, could not bear such violation. Yet she did not punish Poseidon, the one who caused it, because Poseidon was a god, and among gods power often matters more than justice. Her anger, cold and electric, fell instead upon the only one who could not resist, Medusa. If you're listening now, you might wonder, why does wisdom punish the innocent? Why does justice stay silent? Maybe the Greeks already knew something we still forget, that even gods are not free from the instinct to dominate. They create laws, but they don't always follow them. They embody logic, but their emotions still blind them. Athena could not bear her temple's defilement, but she could not strike Poseidon, her equal. So her fury sought the nearest path, toward the mortal who was simply there. Like lightning hitting a conductor, not because it is guilty, but because it stood in the way. That was the first fracture in Medusa's world. The temple was no longer a refuge. Purity was no longer safe. The wisdom she had served had become her judge. The Greeks said Athena did not shout, did not rage. She only looked down with eyes cold as stone and spoke one short sentence. You are no longer worthy of human form. If we look deeper, it wasn't just punishment. It was the price of beauty that crossed the limit the world allowed. Medusa had done nothing wrong, but she existed in the space where gods forbade mortals to stand, between reason and instinct, between Athena's light and Poseidon's dark waves. And in that world, everything in between was crushed so that balance could stay intact. That night, the wind finally stopped. Athens slept beneath a violet-black sky. But inside the temple, a figure sat motionless. She could no longer cry. Her tears, as salty as the sea, were gone, along with her faith. All that remained was silence, and the quiet realization that the gods no longer stood with humankind. Somewhere beyond the shore, Poseidon still roared, and Athena sat unmoved upon her throne. Two forces, sea and mind, locked in a struggle whose only victim was Medusa. If you're still awake now, take a slow breath, because the next part of the story will bring the moment the curse is spoken. When her golden hair begins to stir like serpents, her eyes turn to mirrors, and beauty and fear become one. Let your mind drift with your breathing, like waves pulling back from the shore, slow, soft, and without resistance. No one knew how long Medusa had sat there in the temple. The last light of sunset had faded, and the white marble columns had turned the color of ash. There was no more wind, only the sound of cold stone touching skin. Athena appeared, not in thunder, but in absolute stillness. She looked down at her priestess, the one who had given her entire life in devotion, and in that gaze there was no anger, no mercy, only a still, dry chill, like dew clinging to grass before dawn. Medusa did not beg. She couldn't speak. Like standing before a storm you know will come, all you can do is look and wait. The goddess's curse was not shouted. It was soft, almost a whisper. You once made every gaze fall in love. Now, your gaze will make the world turn away. And then her hair began to move. One strand at a time, soft, golden, stiffened, hardened, and turned smooth like scales. A faint hiss filled the air, like wind slipping through cracks in stone. The snakes did not come from outside her. They came from within. They slid out, curled around her head, and breathed, alive but not cruel. Her eyes, once clear as water, now reflected everything too sharply, so sharply that anyone who looked into them could not bear what they saw. They did not see Medusa. They saw themselves, bare, afraid, without shelter. And in that unbearable moment, they turned to stone. From victim, Medusa became the world's fear. No one dared come near. No one spoke her name. All that remained was wind and stone, and a face no one could look upon again. But if we look deeper into the layers of this myth, we find something deeply human. Every curse is a way the world protects its order. Beauty, once it slips beyond control, becomes terrifying. Pain, when misunderstood, becomes something cast out. Athena did not punish from hatred. She did it because her world demanded boundaries. And Medusa, she was the price of existing between opposites, between God and human, reason and instinct, light and darkness. The Greeks said that after that night, the scent of sea salt still lingered on the temple roof, and beneath the marble floor were faint streaks, like the shadows of serpents sliding past. No one dared clean them. No one dared speak of them. The temple remained untouched, a scar in the memory of Athens, and Medusa, she vanished. No one saw her leave, but they said a cold wind swept through the city, carrying a thin, hissing sound. When dawn came, they found birds turned to stone, fallen on the temple steps. From then on, her name was not spoken in daylight. It became a whisper in dreams, a name only murmured when the moon was gone. And from her story, people learned. Gods can bless, but they can also take away, with just a single glance. Athena returned to Olympus. Poseidon went back to the sea. The world seemed calm again, but in the darkness, a new being had been born, exiled from the temple, unclaimed by the sea, bearing a monster's form, but still a human heart. If you're listening now, let your thoughts slow. Don't dwell on punishment. Don't search for who was right or wrong. Myths were never meant to judge, only to show that conflict lives inside every soul. In light, there is shadow, and in fear, there is something tender. Medusa, with her serpent hair and deadly gaze, was still the child of wisdom and the sea, of Athena and Poseidon, a soul accepted by neither. Tonight, as your eyes begin to close, imagine her hair moving slowly, not to threaten, but like the soft, sad breath of wind. She curses no one. She only sits in the dark, eyes reflecting the moonlight, fading on stone. Not every curse is cruel. Some are simply loneliness given a shape. When the light faded from the roof of Athena's temple, Medusa also faded from the world of men. No footsteps, no farewell, only the wind carrying dust from marble stone and the faraway sound of waves like the sigh of gods themselves. She walked toward the place where the sun never rises, where sea and land melt into each other, where mist grows so thick that even light cannot break through. The Greeks called it the edge of the world, where maps ended and all roads dissolved into fog. Medusa did not choose to go there. The world simply had no place left for her. The gods would not take her in. Humans could no longer bear to look at her. So she walked through an untold journey with no witnesses, only the sea wind following behind her, quiet as memory. Where she arrived, there were no seasons, no clear day or night. only a dim, bluish glow, like moonlight drowned beneath the sea. Each step she took left a print in the sand, and the wind erased it a moment later. She built a small shelter of stone, not a home, just a place to hide from those who might wander too close. Because now her eyes alone could make silence eternal. Around her cave, statues began to appear. No one knew who they once were. Treasure seekers, warriors chasing glory, or simply travelers who had lost their way. They all stood there, frozen mid-motion, a garden of pride and foolishness. The Greeks never described her as a killer. She did not hunt. She did not attack. She simply existed. Those who came to her, driven by greed, curiosity, or fame, met their own gaze, and that reflection turned them to stone. In that stillness, Medusa became the guardian of silence. She spoke no words, yet the world could still hear her. In the wind, in the mist, in the faint hiss of living hair shifting at night. If anyone had dared approach, they might have seen her sitting among hundreds of statues, each with a different expression: fear, regret, awe, even pride frozen in defiance. A garden no one dared to name. Sometimes Medusa went to the sea, but the water no longer reflected her face. It rippled, but gave no image back, as if the ocean itself, her parent, had turned away. Not out of hatred, but out of sorrow, not knowing how to look at its own pain. She stood there, the wind tugging at her serpent hair, carrying it toward the horizon. And in that salty air, the world seemed far away, like a dream she once had. She no longer knew if she was alive or imprisoned, only that everything was so still she could hear her own breath. They said that at the edge of the world, time no longer moved straight. Days repeated like ripples, and nights stretched on like a breath that never ends. Medusa lived there, no longer human, not yet divine. And every time the wind passed her cave, the snakes upon her head stirred slightly, not to frighten, but to echo the world beyond, the world she once belonged to, and now could only remember through sound. If you close your eyes, picture it. A land of pale rock and mist, a woman sitting still, surrounded by hundreds of statues all facing her. No one moves, only the faint rhythm of breathing and the soft whisper of hair that has never stopped living. It isn't hell, it isn't heaven. It's a place both gods and men chose to forget. And because of that, it became the home of all things that were left behind. Tonight, if your thoughts begin to slow, don't try to imagine her face. Myth never described it. Because true fear doesn't live in what is seen. It lives in what you imagine. And in that silence, Medusa does not curse anyone. She simply keeps living, a fracture between two worlds, where light no longer reaches, but darkness does not dare to swallow her whole. While Medusa vanished from the world of light, elsewhere, among men, another story began. It was the age of King Polydectes, a powerful yet small-minded ruler of the island of Seriphos. He loved praise, hated rejection, and craved control over everyone around him. In his court lived Danae, a woman once loved by Zeus, and her son Perseus, a child born of both god and mortal. He grew up with human pride and the quiet absence of a divine father who was never truly there. Polydectes desired Danae. He wanted her for himself, but her son stood in the way, not with a sword, but with calm eyes and a simple sentence. You may be king, but my mother is not yours to command. In a hall full of flatterers, those words fell like a stone into water. No one reacted, but the ripples spread. And from that day, Polydectes began to weave a plan. Months later, he announced a great banquet. Nobles, warriors, and merchants brought gifts: gold, gems, horses, and silks. When Perseus's turn came, he had only his empty hands. Polydectes smiled falsely. "If the son of a god brings no gift, then bring me the head of the Gorgon, the creature all men fear and none dare face." The room fell silent. Laughter flickered quietly. They thought it was a joke. But Perseus didn't laugh. He lifted his head and said softly, as if to the wind, "I will bring it, even if I must travel to the world's edge." In that moment, destiny began to stir, not from prophecy, but from pride spoken aloud. Perhaps the gods heard it, and they smiled, not kindly, but with the amusement of beings watching a game mortals can't understand. Perseus set out, carrying nothing but resolve and a faint faith that his father Zeus would not let his son die without meaning. But that faith was fragile. He crossed barren lands, sailed dark seas, walked through nights without end, and everywhere he went, the story of Medusa was told differently. Some said she was a monster, others said a cursed beauty, and some whispered she lived where the map stopped, where light no longer had a name. On his journey, Perseus met Athena and Hermes. Athena studied him for a long time, perhaps seeing in his eyes the reason she once loved humankind: intelligence not yet hardened into power. She gave him a mirrored shield. "Don't look directly at what you fear," she said. "It will turn you to stone. Look through reflection. Keep your distance from what is real." Hermes, god of motion and wit, gave him a curved sword, steel as light as wind, and from Hades, lord of the underworld, he received the helmet of invisibility, a gift so feared no mortal dared touch it. Perseus took the gifts and bowed. No thunder, no blinding light, only the sense that the gods were watching, curious, distant, as always. Athena's last words followed him. "Do not kill her in hatred. Do it as duty. And remember, what is most dangerous is not the Gorgon, but your own gaze when it meets hers." And so Perseus walked west, toward the red mountains where the sun sinks into the earth. He passed forgotten lands, ruined statues from the age of Titans, cities swallowed by sand, temples with no one left to pray. The wind followed him, carrying salt and faint hissing, as though the sea and fate were slowly drawing two lonely souls toward each other. If you're listening now, let your mind slow down. The story is about to enter a place where light no longer holds its shape. From the world of men, where honor, promises, and power rule, we will soon cross into a realm of silence and mirrors, where Perseus and Medusa will meet, not as enemies, but as reflections of the same human fear. Take a deep breath. Let it out slowly. The next part is the journey to the edge of the world, where even myth fades into mist. From the morning Perseus left the palace of Seriphos, he walked toward the place where maps had no names. West, where the sun died slowly and the edge of the world blurred like ink dissolving on stone. There were no markers on his path, only wind, the only thing that knew the way to the land of the Gorgon. At first there were warm plains, golden and alive, but the farther he went, the more the colors faded. Green turned to gray. Birds fell silent, and only the sound of wind brushing stone remained, like the breath of something sleeping very deeply. The Greeks called that place the after-sun realm, for when the sun set, its light passed through there once more before disappearing from the world. and it was there that Perseus was to meet the fear mankind had woven into myth. He walked for many days. Each night he lay among sharp rocks, hearing the seas echo in his dreams like slow strikes of metal. No one traveled with him, only his shadow and the endless wind. When he slept, he dreamed of faces turned to stone, frozen in fear, yet still holding a faint glimmer of belief that they had chosen rightly. Myth called it the realm between the living and the forgotten, a place without gods, because even gods could not bear to look at what they had created. One morning he came to a land where the ground no longer felt soft, but crunched underfoot like broken bone. The air grew heavy with salt, not the scent of the sea, but of what once was the sea. Ahead, white mist hung like smoke, and behind it, the world of Medusa. Perseus stopped. Here, the wind blew backward. It didn't carry things forward, it pulled them back. Even light could not move through. He understood. This was the edge of the world, where time no longer moved, only repeated, where the sea's breath turned to the sigh of stone, where fear itself took form. To reach Medusa, Perseus had to face the Grey, 3 gray sisters, daughters of the deep sea, kin to the Gorgons. They shared a single eye between them. The Greeks said that when Perseus found them, they were arguing over who would get to see next. He approached quietly, light as air. And as they passed the eye from one to another, he snatched it mid-air and spoke in a voice low as the tide at night. I come not to kill, only to find the way to where she waits. The sisters fell silent. There was no arrogance in his tone, only weariness. They pointed toward the southwest, to where white cliffs met a black sea, where no prayer had ever been heard. He returned the eye, bowed, and as a gust of wind rose, they vanished. The farther he went, the quieter the world became. No more waves, no warmth, only the echo of his own thoughts. Each step made him lighter, as though he no longer belonged to the living. The mirrored shield caught a faint glow, and sometimes, within it, he thought he saw a shadow watching back. Not an enemy, but a girl with hair that moved like breath, eyes full of sorrow, and a smile as faint as dissolving mist. Maybe it was an illusion, or maybe myths have their own way of letting 2 souls know of each other before they meet. At last, Perseus reached a plain of white stone. The ground cracked like a giant's eggshell. Between the cracks stood statues, men, beasts, soldiers, frozen mid-run, silent shapes of fear made permanent. He looked around and understood this was no longer a journey of honor. It was a journey of truth, a thread linking him to humanity's oldest terror, the fear of seeing what we have made and not surviving the reflection. As twilight fell, mist gathered around his feet. The sun sank beyond the cliffs, and in the quiet that hangs between light and dark, Perseus heard something, unclear if it was wind or breath, serpent or hair, slow, soft, like a dream waking after centuries of sleep. He gripped Hermes' sword, pulled on Hades' helm, and raised Athena's mirror shield, not to guide him, but to keep him from looking directly. Before him was a cave where moonlight could not reach, and even the dust in the air stood still. If you're listening now, breathe slowly. We're about to enter the moment where the world itself holds its breath. One wrong glance and everything turns to stone. One right reflection, and myth will change forever. Let your mind grow quiet, like wind falling over the sea. Because in the next part, in that mirrored instant, Perseus will not just see Medusa, but see all of mankind, forever killing what it fears, and calling it heroism. The cave opened before Perseus, not large but deep, as if leading down to the earth's heart, where the sound of time dripped, one drop at a time. Inside there was no fire, only the faint shimmer of moonlight reflected off damp stone. And there, almost inaudible, was the soft sound of Medusa's serpent hair moving in her sleep. Not the sound of menace, but of breathing, slow, tired, as if she had slept for centuries, waiting for something to arrive and end her. Perseus did not make a sound. Each step sank into the mist. The shield of Athena in his hand caught a weak glow, and in that reflection, her face began to appear, not fierce, but sad. So deeply sad, as though she had known long ago that this was how her story would end. She was not the monster people spoke of. There was no hiss, no fury. Only someone forgotten by the world, sleeping in a place no one dared to name. Her hair of snakes, when touched by the moonlight, glimmered like strands of living crystal. No longer a curse, but a sign of life that refused to die. Perseus kept his gaze on the mirrored shield, never daring to look directly. In that reflection, he saw a face once beautiful, and eyes closed in dreams, dreaming perhaps of another world where she might be human again. Time slowed until he could hear his heartbeat. It wasn't the sound of a warrior, but of a man, trembling, mourning for what must be done. Athena had warned him, "Do not look directly, or you will turn to stone." But in that moment, Perseus understood. It is not the gaze that turns us to stone. It is the feeling of having to destroy what we finally understand. He closed his eyes for a moment, then lowered his sword. No sharp ring of steel, only a soft sound, like a bird's wing brushing through a dream. And just like that, Medusa's long sleep ended. No scream, no violence, only silence spreading outward from the cave's heart, slow even, like ripples from a single drop falling into still water. From her blood, light spilled across the stone, and from that light, two beings rose, Pegasus, the white-winged horse, and Chryser, the golden warrior. They did not roar, they simply took flight, as if two pieces of Medusa's soul had finally been set free, one becoming freedom, the other memory. Perseus fell to his knees, not to pray, but to breathe. The shield now reflected his own face, a man, not a hero, just one who had survived the trial of the gods. He looked into it, and for the first time saw himself older, tired, and distant from the faith that had once driven him. In his hands, the severed head of Medusa still had its eyes open. That gaze still lived, not to curse, but to whisper, "You have done what was required, but do you understand what you have destroyed?" The Greeks said that when Perseus left the cave, the wind stopped. Even the sea went still. For one breathless instant, the world paused, watching the end of a story. From then on, Perseus carried the head in a leather pouch, but at night he would sometimes hear a faint sound, like air moving softly through strands of hair. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe it was Medusa, still breathing, still watching, through the layers of leather and memory, into the same world that had turned her into a monster. If you're still listening now, let your breathing match the rhythm of the story. No fear, no pity, just stillness. Because sometimes tragedy is nothing more than the moment the world finally sees itself in the mirror. Perseus had completed his task, but myth never ends there. For even after her death, Medusa's gaze lived on, turning the world to stone in new forms. Power, victory, and glory. When Perseus stepped out of the cave, the sky had changed color. It was no longer night and not yet morning. A pale, suspended light, silver blue like dew resting on stone. In his hands, Medusa's head was heavy, yet warm. The serpents still moved softly, not violently, but like a breath that had not yet left her body. Her eyelids were half closed, but at times he thought. They fluttered, as if she were still looking upon the world one last time. No one had taught Perseus how to carry a head that still lived. He only knew to use Hermes's leather pouch, to wrap it carefully and hang it by his side. But with every step, he heard a faint hiss, like wind slipping through a cracked mirror. The journey home was not a triumph. Every land he crossed, people looked at him strangely, half in awe, half in fear. Because myth has a cruel habit. It turns the pitiful into the terrifying, the wounded into heroes. He no longer recognized himself. Whenever he saw his reflection in water, he turned away, afraid he might see Medusa's shadow within his own, their gazes blending, like two mirrors facing each other into infinity. Legends say Perseus carried the head across 3 realms. In the mountains of Atlas, a titan punished for arrogance blocked his way. Atlas was vast as a range itself. Each step shook the earth. Perseus did not fight. He simply opened the pouch. When Medusa's gaze met the titan's eyes, he turned to stone, his body becoming the mountains, forever holding up the sky. And so, the Greeks named that place Atlas. In the southern seas, Perseus found Andromeda, a young woman chained to the cliffs, waiting to be devoured by a sea beast. Without thought or hesitation, he lifted the head toward the horizon. The creature froze mid-wave, turning to stone beneath the surf. The people hailed Perseus as a hero, and Andromeda looked upon him with admiration. But even in that moment of praise, he felt something hollow. When victory comes too easily, it stops feeling like victory. He no longer knew whether it was his strength or hers, the strength of the woman slain in the dark, that saved them. At last, Perseus returned to Seriphos. King Polydectes, the man who had sent him to die, laughed when he entered the hall. "You return, do you?" With empty hands and foolish hope. Perseus said nothing. He opened the pouch. No scream, no blood, only a burst of white light and silence. When it faded, the entire court stood still. Polydectes and his men had become statues, faces frozen in the same moment of shock, fear, and too late regret. There was no victory, only deeper quiet, as if the world itself had punished its own arrogance. Medusa's head, though severed, continued to do what even the gods could not control, to judge. It did not rage, it only reflected. Whoever looked into it saw themselves. And it was that reflection they could not bear. Even in death, Medusa was still teaching the world its oldest lesson, that true power lies in the gaze, not to destroy, but to make others see what they truly are before they can hide from it. In time, Perseus brought the head to Athena, but before that, he stopped by the sea. The night wind rose and he opened the pouch one last time. Moonlight fell across Medusa's face, now peaceful as if in a long, forgiving sleep. He whispered, "I'm sorry that the world never knew how to look at you." And perhaps, for a brief moment, her eyes softened, as though she had forgiven him. If you're still listening, let your breath fall slow, like sand slipping through an old hourglass. No pity, no blame, only stillness. because sometimes silence is the last form of respect we can offer to pain. The head of Medusa still lived, but no longer to harm. It only watched, reminding the world that all power born from fear will, in the end, turn itself to stone. Perseus traveled for many days, crossing barren fields and cities whose temples no longer stood, until at last he saw the peak of Olympus shrouded in white mist. There, the clouds did not drift. They simply stayed, as if the heavens had grown used to being watched and no longer felt the need to move. In his hands, Medusa's head had finally grown still. The serpents were quiet, her eyes gently closed, as though she had at last found peace. Perseus stood before Athena, goddess of wisdom and order, the one who had once given him the mirrored shield. He did not kneel. He did not bow. He simply stood and held out what he no longer fully understood. Athena gazed at it for a long time, not with emotion, but with the steady eyes of one who recognizes something terrifying and necessary. The Greeks said that Athena spoke no word. She only raised her hand, took the head, and fixed it onto her shield, the aegis. From that moment onward, on the shield of the goddess of wisdom shone the face of fear. And, strangely, the world did not see contradiction in that, but power. The head of Medusa, symbol of fear, of tragedy, became the weapon of order. Athena carried it into every battle, as if to remind the world, wisdom does not soothe, it controls. And so Medusa, once punished by this very goddess, now guarded her, a silent paradox. But in Greek myth, such paradoxes are common, because the world feels safest when the wounded become the symbols of protection. If we look closer, this is not just a story of gods, but of humankind. For ages, we have done the same. When we fear something, we destroy it, then use its image to keep ourselves safe. The Greeks carved the Gorgon's face above city gates. The Romans engraved it onto armor, and Athena herself placed it upon her shield. Thus, fear was sanctified, no longer something to flee, but a mark of strength. In another sense, Athena did not take Medusa's life. She kept her gaze, placing it where the world could bear it, within bronze and iron among the emblems of victory. The eyes that once turned mortals to stone were now used to freeze danger in its tracks. Myth, perhaps, is only the world's way of reconciling guilt with logic. Athena never apologized, but she did not forget. She kept Medusa close. Like one keeps a mirror that remembers, so she would never forget how cruel intellect can be. Perseus left Olympus in silence. He felt neither relief nor guilt, only an emptiness, a space between what had been done and what could never be undone. Above, the gods still spoke, still made their laws, still believed they ruled through justice. But if one listened carefully, beneath the wind of Olympus there was a faint breath, a whisper from the shield, still alive, still watching. The world changed after that. When the Greeks saw the face of the Gorgon, they no longer thought of fear, but of safety, not of tragedy, but of order. They did not realize that with every victory, they were lifting the face of suffering toward the sky and calling it glory. If you're still listening, let your breath grow still. Don't think too much of gods. Think of us, the ones who keep turning what we fear into our protection, forgetting that every charm is born from someone's pain. Medusa, even within Athena's shield, was never truly gone. She only changed shape, from fear into symbol, from victim into weapon. And in the quiet of myth, that remains its most beautiful tragedy. Time passed. Myth, like a dream, never truly disappears. It simply changes form and lingers in the human mind. Medusa, once cursed, began to be seen again through the eyes of new storytellers. In ancient Greece, her face appeared on coins, vases, armor, and temple gates. No longer a monster, but a guardian. Warriors carved her image into their shields, believing that by giving shape to their fear, they could no longer be ruled by it. They looked at Medusa and said, "I do not fear because she fears for me." A strange kind of comfort, to turn what terrifies you into something that protects your heart. By the time of Rome, the image of the Gorgon was everywhere. On the breastplates of emperors, on city gates and frescoes, even upon marble tombs. They believed that her face could make Death himself hesitate and walk past the souls resting within. Looking back, we see that by then Medusa was no longer feared. She had been tamed, turned into a symbol of power over death. The gaze that once turned mortals to stone now held death still. Then came the Renaissance. Art awoke, and with it, the old stories opened their eyes again. Painters, sculptors, poets. They turned toward Medusa once more, not with fear, but with the curiosity of modern minds. Caravaggio painted her, on the round shield of a warrior, lit by a single shaft of light. In that darkness, a pair of wide eyes, a mouth frozen open, not sure if in pain, in rage, or in shock at the sight of her own death. She was no longer a monster. She was a soul suddenly aware of its own tragedy, too real to fear, too human to hate, too beautiful to turn away. From that moment, Medusa stepped out of stone, into painting, sculpture, poetry, and memory. Philosophers saw her as a metaphor for stolen power. Poets saw her as a woman punished for her beauty. Artists found in her face a beauty that refused to be defined. And so, in every age, she wore a new face. To the Greeks, she was protection. To the Romans, power. To the Renaissance, tragic beauty. To the modern age, a voice of the judged and silenced. People say, no one truly dies in art, and they're right. Medusa, though her head was severed, still lives, in thousands of paintings, hundreds of statues, in the quiet eyes of every viewer who meets her gaze. When you walk through a museum and see that face, even carved from stone, you can almost feel a thin, cold breath brush the back of your neck. Not from fear, but from the awareness that you are standing before something once called a monster, but which might only be another shape of loneliness. In the 20th century, women artists and thinkers returned to her again. They said, Medusa was never frightening. She just wasn't allowed to be sad. And so she became a symbol of feminine strength, of those condemned for daring to exist differently, for daring to be beautiful, to look back at the world with their own eyes. The head once paraded as a trophy now hangs in museums as philosophy. And humanity, as always, remains captivated by that gaze. The look of one who was destroyed, but still dared to see. If you're still listening, imagine walking through long, cold halls of stone, light glinting off old marble faces, and among 1,000 myths, one face refuses to let you turn away. Not because you fear it, but because you recognize yourself in it. The beauty once cursed has become a mirror to the world, reflecting the way we judge, then worship, then forget, then search again. Medusa no longer waits at the edge of the world. She is here among us, in statues, in paintings, in logos, and in every question that art still cannot answer. What is beauty, and why are we so afraid of it? The world has changed. Myths are no longer told by firelight, but on screens beneath the glow of countless blue lights. And yet, even in this age, Medusa still looks back at us. No longer carved in stone, no longer trapped upon Athena's shield. Her face now appears everywhere, on shirts, on walls, on magazine covers, and in the sleek emblems of luxury brands, worn as a new kind of power. That face, wide eyes, hair flowing like waves, has become the emblem of beauty that does not fear being seen and no longer fears its own reflection. People call it fashion, but perhaps it is simply humanity's quiet way of making peace with what once terrified it. The Versace emblem, Medusa's face framed by ancient Greek patterns, is everywhere, on jackets, on rings, on glass doors. And though most see it as a symbol of wealth and elegance, few remember it was once the face of a girl cursed for her own beauty. Donatella Versace once said, "I chose Medusa because anyone who looks at her can't forget her, and no one escapes her gaze." A line meant for fashion, but in truth a restoration of a forbidden symbol. Medusa, once punished for looking, is now celebrated because she looks. No longer feared, but met, eye to eye. In films and literature, modern storytellers have found her again. They write of Medusa not as a monster, but as a victim of divine order. A woman turned into a creature to hide the gods' own guilt. Writers of the 21st century say, she was never terrifying, she was just someone silenced for too long. And so, Medusa has become the voice of those once muted, those who no longer seek to be understood, but to be seen once more. Today, Medusa's image is no longer a petrifying stare. It is a mirror. In art, she looks back at the audience, and the audience, knowingly or not, reflects its own fear, its own bias. One sees her as frightening, another beautiful, another sorrowful, and so she keeps changing, shifting with every gaze that meets hers. No gods remain, no curse, only the act of looking, something humanity can never destroy, only learn to live with. If we listen closely, this myth still whispers through time. Every era creates its own Medusas, those who are feared, judged, cast aside, simply because they are different. But the miracle is this: time always returns the gaze. No one stays turned to stone forever. One day, someone always opens the old leather pouch, looks upon that face again, and this time with gratitude, not fear. Now, if you walk through a modern city, neon lights gleaming across glass towers, faces rushing past in the blur of motion. Somewhere, you might see a small Medusa on someone's shirt, and without noticing, the world carries her. A quiet reminder that beauty is not meant to be owned, but understood. If you're still listening, take a deep breath and let it fall. Slowly. Think of the things that once scared you and ask softly, have I ever really looked at them before turning away? Because perhaps a part of you is still Medusa, once misunderstood, still longing to be seen again, gently under the calm light of now. The sea is still there, as it was in the very beginning, when Phorcys and Ceto birthed their children from the salted depths. The waves still rise and fall, steady, forgetting everything that ever happened. They say that far out across the ocean, there's a small island, unnamed, unseen on any map. At night, when the wind moves across the rocks, it sounds like the hiss of serpents, soft, then fading into the air. No one sails near, no one claims to know what lies there. But sometimes a sailor swears he saw a faint light, not from a lantern, but from a pair of eyes that no longer wished to see, only to rest. Medusa is no longer cursed. She no longer turns anyone to stone, because the world has learned to do that to itself, with indifferent gazes, with judgment, with words that turn others to statues. The head once called monstrous is now just the memory of an old fear, too tired to frighten anyone. The gaze that once made men tremble now reflects only silence. And if someone is quiet enough to listen, they might hear a breath, slow, distant, like wind passing through Athena's old shield. It is not a sound of anger, but the sigh of something that still exists, somewhere, inside the memory of humankind. The myth ends here, not with thunder, not with song, but with a long, slow hush. Like watching the sea at dusk, uncertain where the sky ends and the water begins. Medusa never truly died. She only stepped out of sight, becoming part of how humanity thinks about itself. Because in each of us there is a trace of that misunderstood gaze, a fragment of beauty once punished, a quiet wish to be seen, without being feared. If you're still listening, let your shoulders drop. Let your breath move naturally. You don't need to remember every detail. You don't need to hold on to the story. Myths aren't made to be understood. They are meant to slow you down, to remind you that in stillness, even fear grows gentle. Maybe Athena no longer carries her shield. Maybe Medusa has returned to the sea, to where she was born. And maybe her gaze has long since become the moonlight shimmering across the water each night. Not to petrify, but to guide those who lose themselves in their own shadows. So if your eyes are beginning to grow heavy, let them close. There's no need to reach the end, because this story never truly ends. Medusa is still here, in silence, in the wind, in the way we keep searching for meaning inside our fears. And when the night folds shut, remember this: no gaze is ever truly frightening if you are calm enough to meet it. And so, we've walked through a long journey, from the light of Olympus to the cold cave where Medusa slept, and back again to the world of men, where stories are told only so we may understand ourselves. If you're still awake tonight, let your mind drift slowly, because there's nothing you need to remember. Myths aren't meant to be memorized. They exist to quiet the heart before things we'll never fully understand. Perhaps the world is still filled with gazes that make us afraid, with judgments that make us shrink a little inside. But in the silence, Medusa has already taught us that when we dare to look back, fear softens, and even curses turn into wind. If your eyes are growing heavy, let them close. Don't try to stay awake just to hear the ending. The story is enough. The rest belongs to sleep. Take a deep breath in and let it fall out slowly. You're safe. The world keeps turning, and somewhere out there, the sea is still whispering her name. Medusa. Thank you for listening, for staying through the night with a story that's older than memory, to breathe together, and to slow down. If you wish to share more nights like this, where history, myth, and sleep become one, subscribe to the channel and tell me. Where are you listening from? And what time is it there? Wherever you are in the world, sleep peacefully. Because tonight, Medusa isn't looking to turn anyone to stone. She's just smiling,